What's up everybody? This is a video that I have been wanting to make for a long time. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you guys are going to love it too. There is no way you will not have a smile on your face by the end of this one. So a massive thank you to everybody who sent me questions and videos of themselves asking questions. Thanks to the kids, of course, but also thanks to the parents out there that have enabled this to happen. I really appreciate it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, so let's crack on. We've got some great ones, and we're going to start with this one from Leo Bates, who is 10 years old from Nottingham in the UK, and he says this.
How long does it take to build an F1 car from manufacturing its first parts up until the Barcelona test run?
Great question, Leo. Thank you very much for sending that one in. I appreciate it. So Formula One cars are quite complicated bits of kit, as I'm sure you know. Inside a Formula One team's factory where they make the car and they design everything, they make almost all of the bits themselves. The first bits that tend to get made are normally the gearbox and the drivetrain components, and that means it can be things like the internal parts of the gearbox. So there's loads of really complicated cogs and springs and valves and all sorts of things inside a gearbox. Hundreds and hundreds of bits in there, maybe even thousands of bits. Some of them very small, some of them very complicated. And the drive shafts as well, the bit that sticks out of the gearbox and spins to turn the rear wheels of the car. Those kind of components are normally the first ones that get made, and that tends to happen around about July time, roughly. It changes at different teams. Some teams do it slightly later than others, but that would be around July time. And then, of course, as you know, the first test in Barcelona is in either February or March, depending on the regulations for that year. So that is, what is that? July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, 7 or 8 months, probably, between the first components being manufactured and the car actually rolling out onto the track in Barcelona. So that's quite a long time, but the process of designing those bits starts way before that. Maybe even a year before the car actually hits the racetrack, the first bits are starting to be drawn on the computers inside every Formula One team, designed, and then bits eventually get manufactured, but then they have to be tested. The reason we actually start with the rear end of the car, like the gearbox and the drivetrain bits, are because whilst we don't have a full car at that point, we can put the rear end onto what they call a rig, which is a big machine that allows you to run the gearbox really fast as if it was on the back of a racing car and test bits. And we can also bolt one onto the back of an actual engine on a big rig. So the engines are also one of the earliest parts to be made as well. Maybe the engine actually, some components are even made before the gearbox, but that's not done at the Formula One team, that's done at the engine company like Mercedes or Renault, so a slightly different group of people that do that. So there you go, I hope that sort of answers your question. It's typically, I guess, around about 8 months, but that's just the very first components. What's really interesting about Formula One cars is that most of the parts are actually only manufactured or made in the last month before you see the car on a racetrack. So there's so much work happening, and development work and design work, and because they want to leave things to the last minute so they can have more time coming up with new ideas, by far the biggest chunk of all the components that go to make up a car are made in just the last few weeks before we actually see the car on track. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? Now this next one is absolutely brilliant. If you're not smiling once you finish watching this video from a little guy called Brody, well then I don't know what's wrong with you. Check this out.
Hi Elvis, my name is Brody and I'm almost 6 years old. And what do you watch on that TV screen inside of the pits? Do you want to know what my favorite show is? It is Sonic the Hedgehog.
Thanks Brody, you are so cool, man. Thanks for that. That made me smile a lot. I imagine every single person watching this video right now has a huge grin on their face because of you. So thank you very much. Brody's from Canada, all the way from Canada. So thanks, man. Appreciate that. That's really cool. And what a great question. What do we watch inside the garage on our TV screens? Brody, I wish we could watch Sonic the Hedgehog, because I love that show too. It's one of my favourites as well. That would be so much more interesting than some of the stuff that we do put on those screens. What we're actually watching in the garage is kind of the same as you guys when you're watching a race at home. We watch the race on the TV in the garage, so we can see the same video pictures, the same pictures of the cars going round that you have, but we also have a bit more information. We have things like the timing screens that show us how fast each car's going around the lap, what our lap times are, what the order of all the cars is in qualifying, for example. Who's quickest and who's slowest? Do we need to be improving? Do we need to be faster? And if we do, we can tell our drivers over the radio that somebody else might have gone quicker than them, for example. So that information is really useful. And we also have on the screens some of the weather information that tells us if the temperature, the air temperature is starting to drop, or if the temperature of the track is getting a bit higher, and maybe we might need to make some changes to our tyres, for example, or if it's going to rain. Because nobody wants to be on the wrong tyres if it suddenly starts raining and the track gets all wet and slippery, do we? So that information also really helps us to make sure that we can give that information to the driver over the radio, because everyone wears those headsets, don't they? There's big headsets on their head with a microphone. So we can talk to the driver and we can say, look, I think it's going to rain in about 5 laps time, so we might need to think about putting some of those wet tyres on that enable you to grip a bit better in the wet weather. So there's all sorts of stuff like that, but nowhere near as much fun as if it could be Sonic the Hedgehog, and I wish we could do that. Maybe I'll go and speak to some of the F1 team bosses and say, Brody says we should be watching Sonic the Hedgehog in the garage. Anyway, Brody, I know that you're 5 right now, but almost 6, like you said, so happy birthday when it comes, and I hope we get back to having some Formula 1 racing soon that you can watch. Thanks for the question though, man. That's made a lot of people smile. Okay, this next one comes from 7-year-old Tomi Butcher from Wales. Thank you very much, Tommy. This is what he's got to say.
Why is there a safety car in the back of the grid?
Another great question. Thank you very much, Tommy. Why is there a safety car sat at the back of the grid at every single race start? It's not like they're taking part in the Grand Prix, is it? Well, actually, Tommy, it's not a safety car, but it's a medical car. Now, they look very similar, but the safety car is the one that you see sometimes come out onto the racetrack and lead the Formula 1 cars around the racetrack slowly when there's been an accident or an incident when they need to slow everybody down. That's the safety car. The medical car, which is what the guys are sat at the back of the grid, slightly different car. It has a couple of doctors in it, a couple of medical staff with all of their medical kit, all of their first aid kit and equipment. And they're sat there at the back of the grid because that, at the race start, is the time when all 20 cars are really close to each other. They're all racing for position down into the turn 1 and they're all banging wheels, aren't they? Sometimes you get an accident at that moment because they're all so close. As the race goes on, they tend to spread out a bit over the racetrack and the chances of having a big accident are less likely as the race goes on. So because the chances are higher right at the beginning, it makes sense to put a medical car right at the back. We don't often see them because as the race gets underway, the cameras focus on the guys at the front, don't they, and see who's winning or who's overtaking. But behind all of that, the medical car is just following them along the first straight, into the first corner, and then maybe the first couple of corners, just to make sure that if there is an accident or if somebody has a big crash, the medical guys can be there really quickly just to help them out and make sure that they're safe. I mean, obviously we hope they're never ever needed in Formula 1, and Formula 1 cars are incredibly safe now. The drivers are really safe with their crash helmets and their safety suits. They've even got the halo, haven't they now, protecting them, and the cars themselves are also really, really safe. So the chances are they won't be needed, but just in case, just to make sure that everybody's nice and safe, we put the doctors and the medical staff as close as we can to the cars for the first couple of corners so they can be there really quickly. And when they're not needed, once the race gets underway and no one's had an accident, that medical car peels off the racetrack into one of the little service roads, runs around the side of the track, and he finds his way back to the pit lane where he then parks up and waits for the rest of the race. Hopefully he's never needed, like I say, but just in case, he's always there. They're always sat in the car as the race is going on, waiting just in case, and if they're needed, they can burst out the pit lane and get round to wherever the crash was. So that's what it's there for. It's a medical car just to keep everybody super safe in the early part of the race where there's a higher chance of a crash. But thanks again for the question. Great one, mate. Right, next up we've got 9-year-old Makaio Walker and his dad Philip from Utah in the States, and this is what they've got to say.
Hi Mark, we're from the United States and my son has a question for you.
How hard is it to build the cars?
I hope to see you doing your videos still. We really enjoy them and hope this time works out for you and you find new opportunities.
Makaio, thanks man, that's a great question as well, because do you know what, it is quite hard to build these Formula One cars. Have you ever built like a small model car with all those tiny little pieces? Because that's quite complicated, that's quite hard to do, it's really fiddly, isn't it? Well, a Formula One car is a bit bigger than that, but it's still really fiddly because it has lots of little tiny complicated bits. And do you know what one of the hardest things about working on a Formula One car? In fact, there's quite a few hard things, but one of the hardest things, I used to work on the front end of our Formula One cars at McLaren, so that was the bit that I looked after, because each of the mechanics tends to look after one section of the car. So my part of the car was the front end. One of the hardest things about working on the front end of the car is that there's absolutely no space to get your hands in. There's so much stuff inside the front of the chassis that you just can't get your hands in or any spanners or tools in to work. So it's really quite difficult to make changes when you're sort of trying to fit your hands through two little holes in the top of the chassis and there's no space in there. So that's what's hard about that. On the back end of the car, if you're starting to work on, if you're a mechanic who works on like the engine or the gearbox and that kind of thing down the back end, well that gets really hot. That's the hardest thing about that end, is when the car comes in after doing some laps on the racetrack, everything's really hot. The exhaust can be glowing red, the brakes are really hot and you have to be really careful not to burn yourself. So sometimes you have to wear really kind of big, thick, they look really funny, but really big, thick, heat-proof gloves to make sure we don't burn ourselves. A little bit like an oven glove. Have you ever seen your mum or your daddy taking hot things out of the oven with those great big fluffy gloves on so they don't burn their hands? Well, sometimes we have to wear those to work on certain parts of the car. And can you imagine trying to use a spanner or a screwdriver, something quite delicate, with these great big fluffy bulky gloves on? It's quite funny sometimes, but it can make it quite tricky. The other thing is that some of these bits on a Formula One car are actually quite delicate, and the last thing you want to do is break anything, because, well, you'd have a whole team of other people in the garage who'd probably look at you with a big grumpy face if you broke something on our Formula One car. So you have to be really careful when you're doing things up or adjusting things or putting things together that you don't break things. I guess that's a little bit like when you're making your model kits, your model car kits, isn't it? You have to be the same. You've got to be careful, you've got to be really methodical and make sure you do everything in the right order, and you make sure you get all the right pieces in the right places. I guess it's a bit like a giant jigsaw puzzle that's really quite complicated, that's really hot in places, it can get dirty in places, it can be slippery when it's covered in oil. There's all sorts of things that make it complicated. But the other thing is that Formula One mechanics are also very experienced, they're very good at their job. So I guess when you've built 10 little kit car models, you'd become really good at it. And that's the same with us as mechanics. Once we've built a few Formula One cars, well then we kind of know how to do it, and it's not quite as difficult anymore after that. So it's quite hard, but we know what we're doing. We've practiced and practiced and practiced, and that's why we all get to be as good as we can when we're working in Formula One teams. Anyway, thanks for the question, Makaio. Also, love the name. Your daddy told me it's a Hawaiian name. Sounds really cool. Next one comes from 9-year-old Robert Seredyn in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and he asks this.
Robert,
What was the question again?
have you robots in F1?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? Do we have robots in Formula One? Thanks very much, Robert. Because you might think, well, I've never seen a robot in Formula One. Probably don't have any, do we? But actually, do you know what we do? Because inside the factories where all of the teams make their own Formula One cars, there are some big, amazing bits of machinery. Massive, great big things that are cutting and machining and making all the parts that go to make up a Formula One car. And there are some robots that help do that process. So I don't know if you've ever seen on TV before videos of kind of road car factories where they have these big robotic arms that come in and pick pieces up and move them, or they come in and cut things or weld things or cut things with sparks flying off them. Well, that big robotic arm, that's a robot. And we do use stuff like that in Formula One. So there are lots of machines that are automatic, that aren't being sort of controlled by a person, but they're being controlled by a computer system that operates the robots, and then that makes the parts that go on to make the car. So there are some robots working away behind the scenes. Wouldn't it be interesting to see if a robot could actually drive a Formula One car? That would be very cool, wouldn't it? I wonder if a robot could ever drive faster than Lewis Hamilton. Maybe not quite yet, but I wonder if one day robots will become so clever that we can actually drive a Formula One car faster than a human, faster than a person can drive it. That'll be interesting. I wonder if maybe that'll happen one time. There are a couple of racing cars, you know, that in existence at the moment. They're called robo-race cars. You may have seen them, I don't know. But they are cars, racing cars, that can drive without a human. And they're being controlled by computers and systems that do all of the operations and turn the wheel and press the accelerator and things like that without any humans involved. So that kind of technology does exist. It'd be great, wouldn't it? I'd quite like to see it. Would you? Would you like to see it, or do you really like the drivers being in the cars? Interesting. Some people like that idea, some don't. And you know, the other area that I think robots could be quite interesting to explore as to whether they could do a better job would be pit stops. I used to be involved in pit stops for a long, long time. And do you know, one of the slowest parts of a pit stop, you know, pit stops are really fast. They only last for a couple of seconds, don't they? But if you really break that down into little tiny areas, the bit that's probably slowest of all of that is the bit where we have to jack the car up into the air and get the wheels off the ground. Now, we can't jack it up into the air until the car is stopped. And that really is one of the slowest bits of a pit stop. Sometimes the guys on the wheel gun have already got the wheel nuts off before the car has actually got its wheels off the ground. So that's one of the slowest bits. So I wonder if there is a way where we could use a robot to help improve, speed up pit stops, maybe by getting the car off the ground a little bit quicker, by using an automatic system rather than waiting for somebody to jack it up. It's not really allowed in the rules right now, but I wonder if one day we might see something like that. So robots are coming into all sorts of areas of our life, aren't they? They're all over the place, these kind of automatic machines that can do lots of jobs now. So I guess at some stage they'll see more and more of them coming into Formula One in different areas. But the idea of robots driving a Formula One car, I think we might be some way off that yet. But I'd love to know what you think. Would you like to see it, or do you prefer having the drivers in there? Matt Dixey is 8, but he's 9 in September, so not long to wait. Nearly there, Matt. And he's in Essex in the UK, and he has this question.
Hi Elvis, I'm Matt, and I want to get into racing, but it's so expensive, so can you help me of some tips of how to get in it? And also, I've been practicing in R-Factor 2 in go-karts and wanting to beat my dad in a race, so can you give me some advice or tips to win?
Nice one, Matt. Really great to hear that you want to be a racing driver, because do you know what? When people like Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, Kimi Räikkönen, all of these kind of people, when they were your age, they were probably doing exactly the same thing, sitting there dreaming of being a racing driver. And do you know what? Their focus and their passion for it, they were so excited about it, they had that dream and they kept focused on that dream all the way through, and look where it got them. It got them to the very top in Formula One. There is absolutely nothing to say that you couldn't do exactly the same, and to have that passion for it right now at your age is a perfect place to start. Now, in terms of getting into it, what I would say is there are two real methods of doing that now. You can either, if you can, get the opportunity to go and get into a go-kart, maybe see if your dad or your mum can take you to a local kart track and give you the chance to get behind the wheel, because first of all, that's amazing fun, great fun, especially at 9 years old, 8 years old, that's amazing fun. But the other thing is about that, it's quite expensive. So not everybody can afford to do that. It costs quite a lot of money to do. So if you can't do that, don't worry. Because the other way to do it is kind of what you're doing now, getting onto the simulator, practicing and practicing and practicing on things like R-Factor 2. That's a great game or great simulator to use to get better, to develop those skills, to become better and better behind the wheel of a car. And you know, there's actually some competitions now that take simulator drivers or gamers, people who race at home in their own bedrooms, just like you are, who become really, really good, and take those guys because they're so good and have shown that they're so good online. they take them now and put them into real cars without them having to spend any of their own money. So that's really exciting, in that there's a new way to get into racing, which probably didn't exist when people like Lewis Hamilton were trying to get into the sport themselves. So you've got an even bigger opportunity perhaps than somebody like Lewis Hamilton did, because if you haven't got the money to go to a racetrack and start buying go-karts and racing cars, which most people haven't, we could perhaps try the other method that you're doing now. So that's great that you're already doing that. I'm really pleased. In terms of how can you beat your dad, the one thing that I would say is that practice, like with anything, makes you better and better and better. So if you can get more practice on there than your dad can, perhaps when he's not looking, perhaps when he's working, or even when he's sleeping in the mornings, if you get up early, do a few laps yourself, get more practice in, you'll be able to surprise him next time you race, because he won't know how good you're going to be. So that would be my tip. Keep practicing over and over and over and over again, and you will absolutely get better. And maybe one day, Matt, I would love to hear that you have made it as a racing driver. And I'd love to see you on telly being interviewed with somebody putting a microphone under your face, knowing that us lot here on Ask Elvis, the kids special, we got to hear from you first. So there you go. Good luck, mate. Let us know. Keep us informed. If you ever get a chance to get in a go-kart, let me know. Drop me a little message in the comments, and I'll read it. I read all the comments, so please send me a message and let me know how you're getting on. And if you do beat your dad on R Factor 2, absolutely shout about it. Tell me, and I'll tell everybody else on Ask Elvis as well. So thanks very much for your question, Matt. Happy birthday in September. I hope you like the answer. Harrison Bloomfield, who's 7 years old and from Suffolk in the UK, asks this next one.
Hello, Mark. My name's Harrison. How fast do your cars go?
Thanks, Harrison. Do you know what? Loads of grown-ups ask me that question as well, so you're not the only one that wants to know the answer to this. How fast do our Formula One cars go? Well, on a Formula One circuit, in a Formula One racing, I guess the top speeds that they go are around about 220 miles an hour. Now that is fast, isn't it? That's really, really fast. That's way faster than you can ever go on the roads. If you think about on a motorway in England, the fastest speed you're allowed to go is 70 miles an hour. And that, when you're in the car, feels pretty quick, doesn't it? Imagine going 220 miles an hour. That is fast. So they are very, very fast cars. But do you know what's most impressive about them is not just how fast they go in a straight line, is that they can go round corners incredibly quickly. They have so much grip that not only are they really fast, if they were like racing away from a set of traffic lights, they'd beat any car on the road. But when they got to a corner, they'd be able to go around it really quickly as well. And the other thing about a Formula One car is they go that speed, about 220 miles an hour at a circuit like Monza, where they have the Italian Grand Prix, that has a really, really long, fast straight. And because it's really long and fast, it can build up all of its speed to maximum speed. But actually, it goes 220 miles an hour because, have you seen those big wings that it has on the front and the back of the car? Well, those wings are to help it push the car down onto the racetrack so that it doesn't slide around and it can go around the corners quickly. But if you took those wings off, if it didn't have to go around corners and it only wanted to go in a straight line, well, it would actually go much, much faster than that. Do you know, a few years ago, one of the Formula One teams actually took a car out into the desert in America to see how fast it could go if it didn't have to go around any corners. So they found a really big, flat, open space. They took those wings off the Formula One car, so it looked a bit funny, but they then just went as fast as it could possibly go. And do you know how fast it went? Almost 250 miles an hour. That is really quick. Can you imagine going 250 miles an hour down the road in your dad's road car? Wow. Imagine if you opened the window at 250 miles an hour. How blowy and blustery it would get inside the car. Well, a Formula One driver, he doesn't even have any windows. He's just sat there with his head being blown around in the wind. Can you imagine 250 miles an hour? Wow, that is incredibly, incredibly fast. So there you go. Thank you very much, Harrison. I hope that answers your question. They go about 220 miles an hour maximum speed on a Formula One circuit. But if you really wanted to, you can nearly go 250 miles an hour. Maybe even faster these days. Thanks for the question though, mate. Okay, Miguel Van der Linden is here sitting on his own go-kart asking this question. He's in the Netherlands.
What made you decide to work as a mechanic at McLaren.
Thanks, Miguel, and great go-kart, by the way. Love the look of that. That looks awesome. I bet you have loads of fun on that. So why did I want to become a mechanic at McLaren in Formula One? Well, when I was a little kid, I always used to watch the racing on TV, like lots of people, and I loved the cars, I loved how fast they were, I loved watching the drivers, but I was most fascinated by these guys that used to run out of the garage to change the wheels and tyres in a Formula One pit stop. I used to watch it and think, wow, they're amazing, look how quickly they can change the tyres on that car. I'd love to do that. And so eventually, as I got a bit older, I started to think, maybe I could do that. And I used that dream, that passion that I had to chase it. And I did everything I could. I studied hard at school and at college. And then I got a job in a very small racing team. And gradually, over time, I worked my way up towards Formula One, where I was very lucky. I got my dream job at McLaren. And as part of that came the responsibility and the role of being part of this Formula One pit stop. And it was amazing. I loved every single second of it. So I always wanted to work on cars, I always wanted to be around cars and around engineering. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to work on cars, what are the best cars in the world? Formula One cars. So that's what I did. I tried really, really hard and I worked really hard to get into a Formula One team. And eventually that dream came true. And I can promise you it was amazing. I loved every second. So there you go. If that's your dream or something like that, just chase it, just keep going, because dreams can come true, I promise you. Just keep working hard, maybe take your go-kart apart, put it back together a couple of times just to see how you get on. Maybe that's a good way to start. Thanks for the question though, Miguel. The next question comes from a 6-year-old in Suffolk in the UK with a racing driver name. Ayrton Noble asks this one.
Mechanics, how are you so good at fixing race cars when they crash?
Thanks for your question, Ayrton. That's great. How are we so good at fixing racing cars when they crash? Well, we do get quite a lot of practice because racing drivers are really, really good drivers. They're really fast, but sometimes they do crash. And when they crash, we have no choice but to put the car back together. So we practice and practice and practice. Like anything, we keep practicing until we can do it really well. Because one of the things we have to do in Formula One when a race car crashes, and I can tell you, Ayrton, you know when you see all the team inside the garage and they're watching on those screens that little Brody was asking about earlier, when we're watching on those screens and you suddenly see your car that's out on the racetrack, you see it crash, everybody goes, oh no, because all of a sudden you know you've got a lot of work to do. But most importantly, you have to do that work really quickly because they need the car back together again to get back out on the racetrack. So for the mechanics, that's a horrible moment when we see our car crash, because we know that all those pieces are going to be broken and dirty and they all need fixing or replacing or cleaning. So when we finally get the car back to the garage, what we have to do is we pull it all apart, take all the pieces apart. It's a bit like taking a massive Lego project that you've built over a long time, taking every single piece off, cleaning it, making sure there's no damage on every single piece, and then putting new pieces back together. And then we have to build it all back up again. Can you imagine doing that? Doing some big project with Lego where you make a big car out of Lego that takes you ages, and then you hand it over to a racing driver who smashes it up. Imagine how sad you'd be. Well, that's what it's like for us as mechanics. Sometimes the racing drivers, they don't mean to, but sometimes they crash it into walls and smash the car up. And our job then is to start rebuilding it all back together. It can take a long time and it can be really annoying, but that's just what our job is. But because we do it so often, we get really good at it. And that's why Formula One mechanics are the best mechanics in the world, because they can do things like that really carefully, really well, and really fast. Anyway, thanks ever so much for the question, Ayrton. I really appreciate it. Hope that was a good answer for you. Okay, 6-year-old Danny Butcher asks this one.
Why are Formula Ones go so fast?
A great question, Danny. Little Harrison was asking earlier how fast a Formula One car goes, but what you want to know is why it goes so quickly, and that makes total sense. And the reason is that a Formula One car goes so quickly. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, it has a really, really powerful engine in the back. Much more powerful than most of the cars that you see on the road. But the other biggest difference between the cars that you see on the road and the cars on a Formula One track are that Formula One cars are really, really lightweight. So they don't weigh very much. Now you imagine if you're trying to push a really heavy car down the road, if you were behind it with your dad trying to push it if your car broke down, your road car's really heavy, so it takes a lot of effort to try and push it further down the road, doesn't it? Whereas if you were trying to push your bike, for example, down the road, well, that's really lightweight, so you can push it really quickly. So a Formula One car is a bit like that. It's made out of really lightweight materials, and they take out anything that's not needed, like loads of seats and electric windows and a radio and stuff like that they don't need for racing cars. So they get rid of all of that, make it really, really lightweight, and then it can go really super fast. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks very much, Danny. Right, Franek, who's 13 years old from the Netherlands, wants to know this.
Hi Elvis, I'm Franek. I'm from the Netherlands and I have a question for you. Who is your favorite F1 driver?
Who's my favourite racing driver? Well, do you know my favourite racing driver that I had most fun with and actually became a really good friend of mine over the years because I worked with him really closely? That was Kimi Räikkönen. He's still racing now and he's the oldest Formula One driver on the Formula One grid. But when I was working with him, he was actually one of the youngest. But actually one of the best Formula One drivers, because that's the other question lots of people ask me. Who do I think is the best racing driver? Well, I think Lewis Hamilton's very, very good, isn't he? He's won a lot of stuff over the last few years, but you'll probably think that Max Verstappen is maybe one of the best, and he's also really, really good. Max Verstappen might end up being one of the greatest racing drivers we've ever seen because he's still really, really young and probably got quite a few years of racing ahead of him. So I'd love to see Max Verstappen become a world champion. I'm sure you would love that too. So I think Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc is also a really great young racing driver. I really like Lando Norris as well. But my favourite is probably Kimi Räikkönen, just because I knew him so well, I know him so well, and we became great friends. So we had a lot of fun as well as working together too. Hope that answers your question, Franek, but thanks very much for asking it. Right, let's finish with this one, which is a really great question, a technical question from a young guy called Evan, all the way down in Australia.
Hi Mark, it's Evan here. I'm nearly 10 and I'm just wondering, how do the tyres stay on the track when the vehicles are going so fast?
Evan, that's a brilliant question. How do the tyres stay on the track? Because it is hard to understand, isn't it? The cars are going so quickly, particularly when they go around the corners, and yet the tyres, they stay stuck to the road. It's amazing, isn't it? It's one of the most impressive things about Formula One cars, is that they have so much grip. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I talked about earlier on, didn't I, about how the wings, the front and rear wing on a Formula One car, use aerodynamics, the air rushing over the top of the car, to push it down onto the racetrack. So that's the first thing. When they go really quickly, there's so much air pushing the car down that it helps to give it grip. It's like if you push your hand down onto the desk, it's really hard then to move forward, isn't it? Whereas if you just rest your hand lightly on the desk and slide it forward, it's really easy. So if you've got lots of downforce or force pushing down on your hand, it's really hard to slide. So that's what we do. That's what helps us give us loads of grip. And the other thing with tyres, Formula One tyres, well, they are really big, so they have a lot of surface area. So there's quite a lot of tyre that's actually on the road each time. They're a lot wider than the tyres on a road car normally, aren't they? So that gives us loads of grip too. And the other thing about Formula One tyres is that they get really, really hot because the cars go so quickly. When a Formula One tyre gets warmed up, when it gets hot as it's going round and round the racetrack, it becomes really sticky. And when a Formula One tyre gets sticky, it becomes really grippy. It doesn't want to slide, it grips the road. It's a little bit like when you play with some kind of like plasticine or some clay or some dough, Play-Doh. You know, when you squidge it in your hand for loads of time, it becomes a bit warmer and it becomes softer, doesn't it? It becomes easier to sort of squidge around in your hand. Well, that's a little bit like a Formula One tyre. As it becomes warmer, it becomes a little bit squidgy, not very much, but just a little bit on the surface. And that squidginess, that softness, enables it to be a bit more sticky and stick to the racetrack. So it stops it sliding off the road. So a Formula One car can go around a corner really quickly because it has really sticky tyres that are much wider than normal, and they've got the aerodynamics pushing the car down really hard into the racetrack. Do you know that the force that aerodynamics on a Formula One car can push down on a race car with are so great that if you could drive a Formula One car really fast in a tunnel and drive it up the walls of the tunnel onto the ceiling, there'd be so much force from the wings that would be pushing the car. They'd be pushing the car up now because it was upside down. You could actually drive a car with it stuck to the ceiling just by using the aerodynamics to keep it pushed and stuck up there. Isn't that amazing? So you imagine that, the right way up on a racetrack, so much force pushing the car down, it really does keep it stuck to the track and stops it sliding off. So there you go. I hope that gives you a bit of an answer. That's why they can go so quickly and the tyres don't spin off the car and off the racetrack. There you go. Listen, thank you so much, everybody, for all of these questions. I hope this has put smiles on everybody's faces at a time when we're all finding it a bit tough right now to be stuck in our houses. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you kids who asked questions. I hope my answers were okay. And if you've got more questions like this, please do send them in. Thanks to the parents for allowing this to happen as well, because I really appreciate it. I hope we've made a really cool, fun and funny video out of this that I hope you've all really enjoyed. And as I say, any more questions, please do fire them through, and I'd love to be able to do this again sometime. For now though, thanks so much. I'll be back very soon. Ta-da!